I'm always looking for new materials to incorporate into my projects. Although I've used steel a little bit in the past, it's not something that I'm super comfortable with yet. When my father-in-law offered me a reclaimed Douglas fir beam to use, I figured this would be a great opportunity to incorporate some steel legs. Even though working with metal seems a little intimidating, it was actually a lot easier than I expected. Keep watching to see the whole process. This video is sponsored by my friends at the Home Depot. My first job was to figure out how to cut this 5.5 inch wide by 11.5 inch tall beam. Even with 2 passes, it would be a little too thick to cut with a circular saw. I figured this was a good opportunity to try out my new cordless chainsaw from Milwaukee. The length of the beam I was shooting for was about 48 inches. Once the beam was cut, I moved on to the steel legs. I picked up 2 42-inch lengths of 3.5 inch square steel tubing from my local metal supply. They were remnants or drops, which are basically the leftover cut pieces of steel, which are sold by the pound and usually a lot less expensive than buying full 10-foot lengths. The particular tubing that I used had a 3/16 inch thick sidewall. I locked the steel into my clamping jaw horse, but you could also clamp it onto your work surface as well. There are a lot of ways to cut steel. I chose to go with a 48-tooth Cermet steel demon blade from Diablo. It fits on a standard 7 1/4 inch circular saw, but it's designed to cut ferrous metal like steel. I'll link the products that I used in the description box, as well as a link to my website where I give you a little bit more information. I started by cutting the tubing a little bit longer than my desired length. Cutting with a non-abrasive blade was so much faster and so much less messy than cutting with a normal cutoff wheel like on a grinder. With 4 rough lengths cut, I clamped them tightly side by side and aligned one end. I then used a square to make a mark and cut them all at once. That way I was ensured all 4 legs were the exact same length. If you're liking what you see, make sure you hit that thumbs up button down below. In my design where the legs meet the beam, I needed to make a notch on 3 sides of the tubing. To give me a little bit more precision, I decided to use a reciprocating saw for this. I began cutting down from what would be the back side of the leg, all the way down to the front face. I then flipped the tubing 90 degrees and made another cut so I would just be left with a tab on the one front face of the leg. Next, I put a grinding wheel onto my cordless angle grinder. I needed to make sure the edges of the tab were nice and flat so that the metal would sit flush against the side of the beam. The next step was to mark the location to drill the holes. I've discovered a few tips when drilling steel. It's a little bit different than drilling into wood. You typically want a slower speed but more pressure when drilling through steel versus wood. If you go too fast, it won't cut and it will just dull your bits faster. Another tip is to always use a cutting oil to help lubricate your bit. This too will help it cut more effectively and last longer. I drilled 2 5/16 inch holes in the top tab of each leg. I then used a heavy-duty degreaser and some paper towels to wipe off all the grease from the steel surface. To help the paint attach better, as well as to prevent any rust, I sprayed 2 coats of a metal primer on all the surfaces of the legs. The next day, I sprayed 2 coats of matte black enamel spray paint. Spray paint gets a bad rap, but it's actually perfect for painting steel. While the paint on the legs dried, I turned my attention back to the wood beam. This beam was rough sawn and had been sitting outside for a long time. I originally started to sand the surface with a 50 grit belt on my belt sander, but I still wasn't making much progress getting through that weathered surface. I switched to an 80 grit flap disc on my angle grinder, and that worked like a champ. The angle grinder also helped me create more of a textured finish to the surface of the wood. Next, I followed up with a few grits on my orbital sander just to help smooth everything and make it feel a lot nicer, less chance for splinters. For the finish, I used the same technique that I used on my stair tread chair. I didn't want to add any color to the surface of the wood, I just wanted to neutralize those orangey tones that you typically get with Douglas fir. I added a few drops of purple and blue acrylic paint to a matte polyacrylic finish. I then used my HVLP sprayer to apply 3 coats onto the beam. Once everything was dry, I could begin to assemble the pieces. I lowered the beam onto the bench and then spaced a leg 4 inches from each end. I pre-drilled through the holes on the tabs and then drove 2 4-inch 5/16 inch lag screws with washers through each leg and into the beam. I painted my lag screws and washers off camera, knowing that they were going to get beat up a little bit with the impact wrench. Once all the legs were attached and all the bolts were installed, I used a little bit of spray paint into a cup with a paintbrush to touch up all the chipped paint from the heads of the legs. I moved the now very heavy bench into place and I was done. I'm not normally into rustic finishes, but I have to admit I'm in love with the texture of this beam. If you don't happen to have a reclaimed beam lying around, that's okay. You could actually make the top out of several 2x6s glued together and it would look pretty similar. I'll include in the description box a link to the free plans on my website in case you want to go that route. One day I might fill some of those cracks and voids with epoxy just to make sure that they don't spread. In the meantime, I'm thrilled that I was able to work with steel and zero welding was involved. But don't worry, I'll pull out the welder for some future project down the road. If you like seeing mixed materials being put together, check out this video. And while you're at it, take a look at this one as well. You guys keep encouraging me to try new things, so I just want to say thank you, and make sure, if you're not already, to subscribe to the Pneumatic Addict channel. Thanks for watching!